In the history of American entertainment, very few artists have reached the level of influence that Steve Martin has achieved. For more than half a century, he has not only been a comedian, but a cultural phenomenon. By the late 1970s, Steve Martin completely transformed the face of stand-up comedy in America. His performances were no longer confined to small clubs, but spilled into massive theaters and even stadiums, where tens of thousands of audiences laughed together in a single night. His two comedy albums, Let's Get Small and A Wild and Crazy Guy, both sold over 1 million copies and won Grammy Awards, a rare feat for a comedian. On the big screen, he left his mark with films like The Jerk, Roxanne, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and especially Father of the Bride, a movie that has become part of the memory for many American families. But he didn't stop there. Steve Martin is also a successful author with his memoir, Born Standing Up, and the novel Shop Girl, a banjo musician who has won multiple Grammy Awards, and the recipient of an honorary Academy Award in 2013 for his exceptional contributions to cinema. He was also awarded the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, the highest honor for comedians in the United States. Now approaching 80, he continues to captivate audiences with the hit series Only Murders in the Building, proving that Steve Martin's talent doesn't just belong to the past, but remains vibrant in the present. But behind that brilliant string of achievements lies a story that is rarely told. Before he became the man who made all of America laugh, Steve Martin was a boy who grew up feeling like he was never good enough. His father, a stern man who rarely showed affection, seldom gave his son words of praise. Steve has admitted that for many years he kept striving for success, just hoping to hear his father say he was proud one time. Even after becoming America's most famous comedian, the loneliness still followed him back after every performance. After the thunderous laughter of tens of thousands of people came silent hotel rooms, where he had to face the emptiness that fame could not fill. At one point, the pressure and exhaustion led him to walk away from stand-up comedy at the peak of his career, a decision that stunned all of Hollywood. But instead of collapsing, Steve Martin turned those silences into creative fuel. He wrote books, played music, and learned to start over in film and art. His life proves that behind the laughter there are sometimes silent battles, and it is the will to overcome those dark moments that shaped Steve Martin, a man who not only made the world laugh, but also taught us how to get back up after the hardest moments. If the story behind Steve Martin's smile surprises you, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the deep stories about the real lives of Hollywood legends. When Steve Martin's story flashes back to his early years, the scene was not bright stage lights or roaring laughter. It began in an ordinary house in California, where a boy grew up feeling like he was always missing something that others seemed to have so easily: recognition. Steve Martin was born in 1945 in Texas, but his family soon moved to California when he was young. On the surface, the Martin family's life wasn't tragic. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't starving either. However, what profoundly shaped Steve's childhood wasn't money, but the atmosphere in the family. His father, Glenn Vernon Martin, was a strict, principled man who almost never expressed affection verbally. He worked hard, believed in discipline and responsibility, but rarely showed warmth to his son. To young Steve Martin, his father was like a cold wall that he kept trying to climb but never truly reached. In many later interviews, Steve Martin admitted that he always felt like he was searching for something from his father: a nod, a compliment, a small sign that he had done something right. But those moments almost never came. If Steve did something well, his father would often stay silent. If he made a mistake, criticism would come immediately. Gradually, in the mind of young Steve Martin, a very familiar feeling took root: that he wasn't good enough. That feeling wasn't loud or dramatic, but it dug in very deep. It turned Steve into a child who was always observing others, always wondering if he was doing something wrong, if he could do better. And sometimes the most painful thing wasn't the criticism. but the feeling of trying his hardest, yet still not making the one person he most wanted to impress smile. When Steve entered his teenage years, he began looking for places outside the family to feel valuable. It was during that period that he discovered Disneyland. To many people, Disneyland is just an amusement park. But to Steve Martin, it was like a door opening to another world. There, he worked at the magic shop, performed little tricks for tourists, and learned how to surprise people and then make them laugh. For the first time in his life, Steve Martin realized he could make others happy. Strangers laughed when he performed. Kids stopped to watch. Tourists clapped. Those were small moments, but for a boy who had once felt invisible, they were like the first rays of light breaking through the darkness. But even as Steve began nurturing his dream of becoming an entertainer, his relationship with his father didn't change much. In Glenn Martin's eyes, performing wasn't a serious path. He saw it as frivolous, unstable, not worth pursuing. When Steve talked about wanting to do comedy and write for television, his father would often respond with skepticism. To Steve, each time felt like a small stab. Not because his father meant to hurt him, but because he never received the one thing he craved most: recognition. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that even when Steve Martin began achieving his first successes in his career, that gap still existed. When he wrote for television comedy shows and started getting noticed in the entertainment industry, his father still didn't show any particular impression. When Steve stepped onto the stage and began building his name in the world of stand-up comedy, he still didn't hear the words he had waited for throughout his childhood. Many years later, Steve Martin admitted that he had spent a large part of his life striving for success, not just for himself, but also in the hope that one day his father would look at him differently. That was the first psychological wound in Steve Martin's life. Not a major event, not an obvious tragedy, but a silent emptiness that stretched on for many years. It didn't make him collapse, but it shaped the person he became. An artist always seeking ways to connect with others. A man who used laughter to fill the silences he had experienced as a child. And perhaps it was from that very private pain that Steve Martin learned one important thing. If he couldn't make one single person proud of him, then he would try to make the whole world laugh. Steve Martin's teenage years passed in a quiet state that many around him didn't notice. On the outside, he was an ordinary guy living in California, going to school, working part-time, and trying to find his place in the big world. But inside, Steve still carried the familiar feeling from childhood, the feeling that he always had to prove his own worth. While many children found confidence from their family, Steve Martin began searching for it in a completely different place: the world of magic, stages, and imagination. For him, those little magical things weren't just entertainment. They were doors leading to another reality where he could control everything, where the rigid rules of everyday life temporarily disappeared. Steve started getting drawn into books that taught magic, optical illusions, moments that made audiences widen their eyes in amazement. He practiced for hours in front of the mirror, repeating every small movement until it became perfect. With each successful trick, Steve felt like he had just created something special, a moment that others would remember. And then, the first opportunity to step into the performing world came in a very simple way. Steve Martin began working at Disneyland, California's famous amusement park. To many people, it was just a part-time teenage job. But for Steve, Disneyland quickly became a refuge, a world where creativity and imagination were welcomed. Steve's job at first was very simple, selling magic books and small kits to visitors. But just selling wasn't enough for him. Steve started performing little magic tricks right at the counter for curious tourists who stopped to watch. A coin disappeared, a card appeared in an unexpected place, a handkerchief suddenly turned into something else. Those small performances made kids burst out laughing, made adults surprised. And for the first time in his life, Steve Martin realized something he had never clearly felt before. Other people were paying attention to him, not because he made a mistake, not because he did something wrong, but because he had made them happy. That feeling for Steve Martin was like a warm beam of light shining into a part of his soul that had grown used to doubt. Every time a group of tourists stopped to watch, every time they laughed or clapped, Steve felt he had value. Those moments could be very brief, sometimes lasting only a few minutes before the crowd moved on, but they were enough to change how he saw himself. At Disneyland, Steve Martin was no longer the boy always wondering if he had disappointed his father. There, he was a performer, someone who could make others stop in the middle of a crowd just to see something interesting happen. It was right there that the passion for performing began to grow in Steve Martin. Magic led him to the next steps, telling funny stories, experimenting with ad-lib lines, learning how to read the audience's reactions. Steve observed how people laughed, how they responded to small surprises. He gradually understood that the stage wasn't just a place to show off skills, but also a place to connect with people. And for a young man who had once felt unseen, that connection carried much deeper meaning. Those afternoons after school, Steve Martin stood in the magic shop at Disneyland, performing little tricks for tourists. Perhaps none of them knew they were witnessing the very first steps of a future comedy legend. But for Steve, those moments weren't the start of fame. They were simply rare seconds when he felt he belonged somewhere, a place where the laughter of strangers could erase the sense of failure he had carried with him. And perhaps it was in those simple days, amid the cheerful music of Disneyland and the little magic tricks, that Steve Martin began to realize his path, the path of a man who would spend his entire life turning imagination into laughter for the world. But the road from a teenager performing small magic tricks at Disneyland to a true American artist was not easy at all. When he entered his early adulthood, Steve Martin left the familiar world of the amusement park and began trying his hand in the professional entertainment industry. This was a period that very few people know about, a long stretch filled with silent effort and constant doubt. Steve moved on to writing comedy scripts for television, working behind the scenes for entertainment shows and other artists. On paper, it seemed like a step forward, but in reality, his life back then was extremely precarious. The money from writing scripts wasn't much. The work wasn't stable. Small contracts came and went. Steve Martin lived in a small, simple apartment, so modest that many people wouldn't even believe the man who once lived there later became a Hollywood legend. His days passed in familiar repetition, writing, revising, rewriting, then sending his humorous ideas to people he hoped would notice them. In the entertainment world, where stage lights usually only shine on famous faces, people like Steve Martin back then were almost invisible. He wrote jokes that made audiences burst out laughing, but the person standing on stage was someone else. He created humorous moments, but his name was rarely mentioned. There were evenings after finishing his writing work when Steve stepped outside, looked at the quiet streets, and wondered whether all these efforts would really lead to anything. His career at that time was like a long road with no signs. Nothing guaranteed where he would end up. The hardship of a struggling life isn't always dramatic. It often shows up in very small details, simple meals, bills that have to be carefully calculated, days spent waiting for a phone call from some producer. Steve Martin wasn't the only one who went through these things in the entertainment industry, but for him, they carried a familiar feeling from childhood, the feeling that he was still trying to prove something to the world. And sometimes, in the quietest nights, doubts began to creep into his thoughts. There were times when Steve sat alone in his small apartment, staring at pages filled with humorous ideas, and asking himself a simple but heartbreaking question. Maybe I'm just not funny enough. Maybe I'm not really funny. Maybe other people are better. Maybe this dream isn't for me. Those are thoughts that almost everyone pursuing art has experienced, but few ever say out loud. Because behind every success story, there are usually long years that no one sees. Years when the artist has to keep moving forward, even without knowing whether the road ahead leads anywhere. But if there was one thing that set Steve Martin apart during this period, it was his almost silent persistence. He kept writing, kept experimenting with new humorous ideas, kept observing the world around him and turning the strange things in life into stories that could make others burst out laughing. Gradually, his talent began to get noticed in the television world. Steve Martin started writing for famous shows like the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. That job eventually brought him a small breakthrough, an Emmy Award for writing, but even that moment didn't instantly turn him into a star. To most audiences, Steve Martin was still an unknown name working behind the scenes. Yet it was during those invisible years that Steve Martin was quietly building what would later change all of American comedy. He developed a completely different comedic style, absurd, surprising, sometimes so quirky it was hard to understand. It wasn't simple jokes. It was a way of looking at the world full of imagination, where silliness and intelligence could exist at the same time. And even though those years were full of difficulty, Steve Martin kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Because deep down, even when he sometimes wondered if he was funny enough, there was still a part of him that believed the laughter he was trying to create would one day find its way to audiences. And when that happened, the whole world would know the name Steve Martin. Those long years of living in obscurity finally began to change by the late 1970s. After many years of writing scripts behind the scenes and experimenting with his unusual comedic ideas, Steve Martin decided to step onto the stage as the main performer. At first, not many people knew what to think of his style. He didn't tell jokes in the familiar way. He didn't stand still on stage delivering predictable punchlines. Instead, Steve Martin appeared with a strange energy, random remarks, absurd jokes, seemingly meaningless actions that made audiences laugh uncontrollably. He wore an arrow through his head, dressed in a white suit, played banjo, danced on stage, and turned the entire performance into an almost surreal experience. At first, audiences didn't know how to react. But then something strange happened. They started laughing. And once they laughed, they couldn't stop. In just a short period of time, Steve Martin was no longer a performer in small clubs. He became a phenomenon. His shows began selling out in hours. Big theaters couldn't hold enough seats for the audiences who wanted to see him perform. Eventually, something unprecedented in the history of American comedy happened. Steve Martin started performing stand-up comedy in massive arenas and stadiums. Tens of thousands of people filled the stands, waiting for a comedian to step out and make them laugh. For a comedian, this had almost never happened before. Comedy had always been seen as an intimate, close-up form of entertainment meant for small spaces. But Steve Martin completely changed its scale. His fame spread at lightning speed. The comedy album Let's Get Small, released in 1977, quickly became a phenomenon, selling over 1 million copies and winning a Grammy. Just 1 year later, the follow-up album, A Wild and Crazy Guy, achieved similar success. His funny lines became catchphrases in popular culture. Audiences wore white suits like his when they came to shows. Steve Martin's absurd jokes were repeated on the streets, in schools, and on television. In a very short time, he wasn't just a famous comedian. He became the biggest comedian in America. To the public, Steve Martin's story at that point seemed like a dream come true. The man who once lived in a small apartment and wondered if he was funny enough was now standing in front of tens of thousands of people every night, making them laugh so hard they couldn't breathe. Stage lights, applause, the admiration of audiences. It all seemed to arrive at once. But the terrifying speed of that success came with a price that few people noticed. Steve Martin's fame exploded so fast that even he sometimes couldn't keep up with what was happening. Just a few years earlier, he had been an unknown writer. Now, every time he stepped onto the stage, tens of thousands of people screamed just at the sight of him. Back-to-back shows, connecting flights, non-stop interviews. Steve Martin's life turned into a whirlwind. And in that whirlwind, one thing began to change very slowly but very deeply. Audiences no longer came just to hear him tell jokes. They came because they already knew Steve Martin would make them laugh. Often, just by stepping onto the stage, the audience was already laughing before he said anything. At first, it felt like a miracle, but gradually, it made Steve feel an indescribable emptiness. Comedy, for him, had always been an intellectual game between the performer and the audience. But when the audience laughed before the joke was even spoken, that game began to lose its original meaning. In the eyes of the world, Steve Martin was living in the most glorious period of his career. He was the man who made all of America laugh. But deep in his mind, he began to feel something that few people could understand. This fame had come too fast, too big, and sometimes too heavy. And right in the moment when everyone believed Steve Martin had conquered the peak of American comedy, a quiet question began to emerge in his heart, a question that would later change his entire life. What happens when the laughter of the whole world is no longer enough to fill the silence inside yourself? But even as Steve Martin stood at the height of his career, something quiet began to happen that audiences couldn't see from below the stage. To the public, his life at that time seemed like a brilliant dream. Stadiums packed with fans, thunderous waves of laughter, articles praising him as the man who changed the face of American comedy. But behind all those moments was a completely different life. A life made up of packed tour schedules, constant flights, and long nights in identical hotel rooms. Steve Martin's life no longer had the normal rhythm of a human being anymore. It became an endless chain of different cities, different stages, different audiences, repeating without stop. Every day of his was almost identical to the one before. Fly to a new city. Rehearse, prepare for the show, step out in front of tens of thousands of people, make them laugh, then leave the stage amid roaring applause. But after the lights went out, after the audience left and the stadium became empty, Steve Martin would often return to his hotel alone. No close friends traveling with him, no family waiting, just long, quiet hotel hallways leading to a room identical to hundreds he had stayed in before. For many people, fame brings a sense of connection to the world. But for Steve Martin during this period, it sometimes brought the opposite. The more famous he became, the more he felt like he was living at an invisible distance from everyone around him. When he stepped outside, people recognized him instantly. They smiled, asked for autographs, wanted photos, but those encounters rarely lasted more than a few minutes. After that, they left, and Steve returned to himself. There was one particular night that Steve Martin later recalled as a very real moment in his life. It was after a massive performance where tens of thousands of people had laughed and applauded non-stop. The show ended in cheers, just like so many shows before it. But when Steve returned to his hotel room, the contrast between the two worlds became so clear it was almost painful. Just a few hours earlier, he had stood in the middle of a sea of people. Now, the room in front of him was completely silent. No laughter, no talking, no one there at all. Just the soft light of the hotel room and the silence. It was in moments like that when Steve Martin began to feel something he had never clearly experienced before: loneliness. Not because he wasn't successful. On the contrary, he was more successful than ever. But success can sometimes feel like a giant mask covering your true self. Everyone saw the comedian Steve Martin, the man who made all of America laugh. But very few saw Steve Martin, the person behind the jokes, the one sitting in a quiet hotel room after every show. Gradually, the exhaustion began to build up. Not just physical exhaustion from the flights and back-to-back performances, but mental exhaustion too. Steve Martin started wondering if his life was becoming an endless loop with no stopping point. Every night, he made tens of thousands of people laugh, but when that laughter ended, he returned to the same familiar emptiness. And what confused him most was, he was supposed to feel happy. He was living the dream that millions of other artists longed for. But the truth is sometimes more complicated than what the world sees. Success doesn't always bring a sense of completeness. For Steve Martin, the years standing at the peak of American comedy gradually became a period when he had to face the hardest questions about himself. He began to realize that the audience's laughter, no matter how powerful, could never fully fill the silences in his own life. And while all of America kept laughing at Steve Martin's jokes, he himself began stepping into a phase full of reflection, a phase where he had to ask whether he could keep living this life forever. And then, in 1981, when Steve Martin was standing at a peak that most artists could only dream of, he made a decision that left almost all of America puzzled. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a failure, and it wasn't because the audience turned their backs on him. On the contrary, Steve Martin walked away from stand-up comedy at the exact moment when he was the biggest comedian in America. His shows were still selling out. Tens of thousands of people were still flocking to stadiums just to see him step onto the stage. His comedy albums were still selling strongly. His name was still appearing on television, in newspapers, and in every conversation about comedy. Career-wise, there was no reason for Steve Martin to stop, but he himself understood something the world couldn't see. If he kept going down that path, he would lose himself. To audiences, Steve Martin was a phenomenon, but to Steve Martin, stand-up comedy by then had begun to change in a way that made him anxious. When he first started performing, every joke was a new discovery. Every show was a conversation between him and the audience. But as his fame exploded, everything gradually became different. Audiences came with preset expectations. They knew Steve Martin would make them laugh. They knew the kinds of jokes he usually did. And often, just by stepping onto the stage, they were already laughing before the joke was even spoken. At first glance, that was every comedian's dream. But for Steve Martin, it made him feel like he was becoming a copy of himself. The shows started to feel familiar in a frightening way. The jokes were repeated. The audience reactions were the same. And Steve Martin began to realize that what he had loved about comedy from the very beginning, the surprise, the creativity, the freedom, was slowly disappearing. There were nights when he stood on stage in front of tens of thousands of people, hearing the laughter echoing throughout the arena. But in his heart, a frightening thought appeared. I'm performing myself again. Not the real version of himself, but an image that the audience expected. And the more famous he became, the harder it was to escape that image. Steve Martin understood that if he continued down this path, he could become a comedy machine, a person, repeating what the audience wanted to hear, but no longer the creative artist he had once longed to be. The decision to leave stand-up comedy, therefore, wasn't an impulsive act. It was the result of many months, even years of reflection. Steve Martin knew that what he was about to do would surprise a lot of people. Millions of fans who loved him wouldn't understand. Hollywood producers wouldn't understand either. To them, Steve Martin had a perfect career. But Steve Martin himself knew there was something more important than success: being honest with himself. So in 1981, he stepped down from the stand-up comedy stage. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic announcement. He simply stopped performing. To the audience, that silence left them confused. Many wondered if he would come back. Some thought it was just a temporary break, but the reality was that Steve Martin had closed the biggest chapter of his career. This was one of the boldest decisions an artist can make, because leaving behind what made you most famous also means stepping into completely unknown territory. Steve Martin didn't know if audiences would accept him in a different role. He didn't know if Hollywood would take him seriously. And he wasn't even sure what his next path would be. But he knew one thing for certain. If he kept standing on that stage, kept repeating what he had done hundreds of times before, he would gradually lose the real part of himself. And for Steve Martin, that was more frightening than failure. So he chose to leave, not because he could no longer make audiences laugh, but because he wanted to rediscover the reason he started making people laugh in the first place. That decision marked the biggest crisis in Steve Martin's career, but it was also the moment that showed his true strength, because very few people dare to leave the peak when they're standing on it. But Steve Martin did it, and as the door to stand-up comedy closed behind him, an entirely new chapter of his life began to open, one that even he didn't yet know where it would lead. When Steve Martin left the stand-up stage in the early 1980s, many in the entertainment industry believed it could end his career. In Hollywood's eyes, Steve Martin at that time was just a stage comedian, a phenomenon of television and comedy albums. But film was a different world, where producers were often skeptical of artists coming from comedy stages. To them, a comedian who could make audiences laugh for a few minutes on stage didn't necessarily mean he could become a real actor on the big screen. So when Steve Martin began shifting toward film, he didn't enter Hollywood as a star. He entered as someone who had to prove himself all over again. That skepticism wasn't unreasonable. Hollywood had seen many comedians fail when trying to transition to film. What made them shine on stage didn't always work on screen. Steve Martin understood this clearly. He knew that fame from stand-up comedy wouldn't be enough to keep him standing long-term. If he wanted to survive in the film world, he had to show everyone that he wasn't just a joke teller. He was an artist who could create real characters. One of the first films that brought Steve Martin closer to movie audiences was The Jerk. The movie carried the quirky comedic style he had developed on stage, absurd situations, unexpected jokes, and a main character who was both naive and pitiful. The Jerk quickly became a comedy phenomenon, showing that Steve Martin could bring his uniqueness to the screen without losing his artistic identity. But that success didn't immediately make his path easier. In the years that followed, Steve Martin continued searching for suitable roles to prove he wasn't just a familiar comedic face. With Roxanne, he not only starred but also helped write the script, creating a modern version of the Cyrano de Bergerac story. The film didn't just make audiences laugh, it also brought romantic and touching moments, showing that Steve Martin had far more subtle acting ability than many had thought. That role earned him greater respect from Hollywood. Gradually, audiences began to see Steve Martin in a different light. He was no longer just the comedian who once made tens of thousands laugh in stadiums. He became a film actor who could bring depth to his characters. Success continued with famous films like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and later Father of the Bride. In Father of the Bride, Steve Martin played a worried and clumsy father preparing to give away his daughter. That role brought a very human side to him. Funny, but also full of emotion and relatability. The film became one of the most beloved works in his career, and made many American families remember Steve Martin as the image of a lovable dad. Slowly, Steve Martin achieved what very few artists do. He rebuilt his career in an entirely new field. Hollywood began to see him not just as a comedian, but as a genuine actor. But even as his film career grew stronger, Steve Martin's personal life at that time was still far more fragile than what audiences saw on screen. On the outside, he was a successful Hollywood star, but inside, Steve Martin was still the man familiar with silences. The years pursuing a film career brought him fame and respect, but they didn't immediately bring stability to his personal life. His personal relationships sometimes still faced difficulties, and the loneliness he had experienced during his stand-up performing years hadn't completely disappeared. Perhaps that is the paradox of Steve Martin's life. The more successful he became, the more he learned that fame could not replace the simple things a person truly needs: connection, peace, and the feeling of belonging somewhere. And as his film career gradually stabilized, a new challenge was waiting ahead, a challenge that didn't come from the stage or from Hollywood, but from his own personal life. After many years of focusing almost entirely on his career, Steve Martin finally found something he hoped would bring stability to his personal life: love. During his years working in Hollywood, he met the British actress Victoria Tennant. Victoria was not only beautiful, but also intelligent, charming, and shared the same artistic environment with him. When they met, many around them believed this was a perfect couple. Both were successful artists who understood the pressures of the entertainment industry and could share experiences that outsiders found hard to understand. When Steve Martin and Victoria Tennant married in 1986, Hollywood press wrote about them as a beautiful love story in the film world. After many years of living in lonely hotel rooms and constant travel, Steve Martin finally had a home to return to. The early years of the marriage seemed to bring Steve a sense of peace he had been searching for a long time. The two appeared together at film events, collaborated on artistic projects, and shared what seemed like a stable life amid the turbulent world of Hollywood. But like many marriages in the entertainment industry, their life gradually became affected by pressures the public rarely sees. Steve Martin's career continued to grow with major films, increasingly busy schedules, and long trips. Hollywood is glamorous on the surface, but underneath it's an environment that can easily make relationships fragile. Over time, distance began to appear, not because of a lack of affection, but because of very different rhythms of life and growing pressures. Work, film projects, expectations from the public and from the entertainment industry itself made them gradually drift apart. The small things in married life started becoming hard to resolve when two people lived in a world where schedules changed every day. For Steve Martin, who had experienced many years of loneliness before starting a family, this crack wasn't just a marriage problem. It touched a deep fear he had once tried to forget, the fear that he would return to loneliness again. By 1994, Steve Martin and Victoria Tennant's marriage officially ended in divorce. To the press, it was just another piece of news among Hollywood's many breakups. But for Steve Martin, it was a major emotional shock. After years of building his career and trying to create a stable personal life, he once again had to face the familiar silence in his life. The home that once had conversation now became quiet. Evenings no longer had anyone to share with after a long day of work. The years after the divorce became a long and difficult period for Steve Martin. On the outside, he was still a beloved Hollywood star. His films continued to be released. Audiences still laughed at the characters he portrayed on screen. But his personal life entered a very different time. Many years later, Steve Martin admitted that there were periods when he lived quite withdrawn, spending a lot of time on work, writing, and personal artistic projects. Perhaps what made this period more heartbreaking was the contrast between his public image and the reality of his life. On screen, Steve Martin often played funny, warm characters, sometimes a lovable father or a man who made audiences burst out laughing. But in real life, he went through quite lonely years, not the dramatic or tragic kind of loneliness, but the quiet loneliness of someone who had grown used to coming home alone after long work days. Even so, during those difficult years, Steve Martin never stopped creating. He continued writing books, developing film projects, and finding other ways to express himself through art. But deep inside, there was still an emptiness that his career couldn't fill. It was the desire for a real family life, a place where he could feel he wasn't just an artist or a Hollywood star, but simply a normal person who was loved and belonged. And it took many more years, after long periods of living in silence, for Steve Martin to find a second chance at that. After the 1994 divorce, Steve Martin's life entered a quiet phase, very different from his familiar public image. There were no major scandals, no dramatic stories in the papers, just a slow withdrawal from the noise of social life. While Hollywood kept spinning with new films, premieres, and red carpet events, Steve Martin gradually lived more privately. He didn't disappear from art, but the way he lived and created began to change. Instead of appearing constantly in public, he spent more time on personal work, writing books, composing music, and exploring other artistic fields he had always loved but never had enough time to pursue before. Writing became one of Steve Martin's spiritual refuges. He began spending many hours a day thinking, noting, and writing his own stories. No more nights performing in front of tens of thousands of people. No more rushed flights between cities. His pace of life slowed down. In that quietness, Steve Martin found a different kind of creativity, deeper, more private. He wrote novels, scripts, and later the famous memoir Born Standing Up, where for the first time he honestly shared his journey to becoming a comedian and the complex emotions behind the stage lights. Alongside writing, music also became an important part of his life. Since he was young, Steve Martin had loved the banjo, a traditional instrument in American music. But during the busy years of his comedy and film career, he rarely had time for it. After the divorce, the banjo became a quiet companion. There were evenings when he sat alone at home, practicing simple melodies, letting the music fill the silent space. Those notes weren't for huge audiences like his old comedy shows. They were like a private conversation between him and himself. In addition, Steve Martin also began to take a deeper interest in painting and art collecting. He read many books on art history, spent time visiting museums, and conversed with other artists. These activities helped him find a world beyond Hollywood, a world where creativity didn't always have to be tied to fame or box office revenue. For Steve Martin, it was a way to keep his mind alive and vibrant, even when he was no longer standing under stage lights as often as before. But even though his outward life seemed calm and filled with creative activities, inside, Steve Martin was still going through a difficult inner period. There were nights when all the day's work was done, when the house became quiet, and he began thinking about time passing by. The energetic years of youth, the packed stages, the roaring laughter, all of it seemed to belong to a different phase of life. Steve Martin began to realize that he was getting older. That awareness didn't come suddenly, but appeared gradually in very ordinary moments, when looking in the mirror, when remembering the years before, when seeing friends around him starting families and having children. Meanwhile, his own life remained quite solitary. At times, Steve Martin wondered if his life had taken a different path from what he once imagined. He had achieved so much that an artist could dream of: fame, success, respect in the industry. But there was one thing he still didn't have: a real family. There were thoughts that Steve Martin rarely expressed in public, but they still existed during those years. He wondered if he would ever become a father. He wondered if someone would come into his life and stay for the long term. And sometimes, in the most honest moments with himself, he feared that perhaps it would never happen. This was probably the most difficult inner phase in Steve Martin's life. Not because he had failed in his career, but because he was facing very profound questions about the meaning of life. Success had come. Fame had come. But what would come next? And would all those achievements be enough to fill the emptiness that people sometimes feel when they've been alone for too long? During those quiet years, Steve Martin didn't immediately find the answers, but that very period of stillness prepared him for an unexpected turning point in his life, one that even he didn't anticipate. Because after many years of living in quiet solitude, one day, when he least expected it, Steve Martin's life changed once again. But it was precisely during those quiet years, when Steve Martin's life seemed to slow down and the world around him no longer spun as frantically as before, that he began to find a new source of energy from something that had followed him for a very long time: music. Ever since he was a young man working at Disneyland, Steve Martin had a special love for the banjo, an unassuming instrument that carried the soul of American folk music. While he was busy with comedy stages and film, the banjo was just a small hobby, a pastime in the rare moments of free time. But in the period after his divorce, as his life became quieter, the banjo gradually became an important part of his daily life. There was something very special that happened when Steve Martin sat down with a banjo in his hands. No more stage lights, no more laughter from tens of thousands of people. Just the sound of the strings ringing in the quiet room. For Steve Martin, music brought a feeling completely different from comedy. Comedy needs an audience to exist. A joke only has meaning when someone laughs. But music is different. A melody can exist even when no one is listening. That was exactly what made the banjo a spiritual refuge for him. When playing the banjo, Steve Martin didn't need to be a funny character, didn't need to make anyone laugh, didn't need to meet the public's expectations. He just needed to focus on the notes, on the rhythm, on the feeling of each melody being created. It was a kind of freedom he hadn't felt in many years while living under the constant attention of Hollywood. Those evenings practicing banjo weren't performances, but they helped him rediscover the simple joy of creation. Gradually, Steve Martin no longer saw the banjo as just a personal hobby. He began taking music seriously. He practiced more, learned from famous bluegrass artists, and tried composing his own pieces. The interesting thing was that in the music world, Steve Martin wasn't treated like a Hollywood star. There, he was just a banjo player learning and growing like any other musician, and that made him feel humble but also very real. After many years of quietly practicing and composing, Steve Martin decided to release his own banjo album. Many in the entertainment industry were initially quite surprised. They knew him as a comedian, an actor, a writer, but a serious banjo artist? It seemed to go beyond the public's familiar image of Steve Martin. But when the album The Crow, New Songs for the Five-String Banjo was released, the music community's response proved he wasn't just trying it for fun. The album was warmly received and ultimately won Steve Martin a Grammy Award in the bluegrass category. That moment carried a very special meaning for Steve Martin. He had won Grammys for his comedy albums in the past, but this award was completely different. It didn't come from jokes or comedy performances. It came from music from a very private part of who he was. It was recognition that Steve Martin wasn't just the man who made the world laugh, but also an artist who could create in many different fields. More important than the award, music brought Steve Martin a sense of balance he had lacked for many years. Hollywood can be very noisy, very competitive, and sometimes very exhausting. But when he picked up the banjo, all that pressure seemed to disappear. Music allowed him to return to himself, to the simple joy of creation he had once felt as a young man performing magic tricks at Disneyland. In a way, the banjo helped Steve Martin rebirth his own art. Not by returning to the past, but by opening a new chapter in his creative life. And what's astonishing is that after all the successes and failures he had gone through, Steve Martin still proved that a true artist never stops searching for new ways to express themselves. But even as music brought healing to his soul, Steve Martin's life still lacked one thing. He hadn't yet found a person to share that life with. And it was precisely when he least expected it that love entered his life once again. After many years of living in the quiet rhythm of creation and music, when Steve Martin seemed to have grown accustomed to a relatively solitary life, something unexpected happened in his life again. It wasn't a major film, it wasn't a new award, but the appearance of a woman completely different from the glamorous world of Hollywood. Her name was Anne Stringfield. Anne wasn't a movie star, nor was she a celebrity in the entertainment industry. She was a writer working for the New Yorker magazine, someone who lived quite privately and almost stayed away from the spotlight of the media. That very difference made the relationship between Steve Martin and Anne Stringfield special right from the beginning. The two met in a very simple way, not at a big movie premiere or a lavish Hollywood party, but through writing work and intellectual conversations. Anne Stringfield was known in journalism circles for her intelligence, humor, and sophistication. Steve Martin, who had always been drawn to deep conversations rather than small talk, quickly felt a special connection with her. After many years of living in relationships influenced by Hollywood's lights, meeting someone completely outside that world brought him a fresh and peaceful feeling. Their relationship developed slowly and discreetly. There were no big headlines in the press, no noisy public appearances. Steve Martin and Anne Stringfield seemed to deliberately keep their life away from media attention. For Steve, that meant a great deal. After years of living under stage lights, he understood clearly that public attention could make private things fragile. This time, he wanted to protect his relationship from the noisy world outside. By 2007, Steve Martin and Anne Stringfield officially married in a small ceremony so surprising that many guests thought they were just attending a regular party. Some of Steve's close friends, including well-known faces in the entertainment world, were invited without knowing they would witness a wedding. That very simplicity reflected exactly the life Steve Martin wanted in this phase of his life. No more grand events, no more pressure to be the center of attention. Just a small ceremony where two people decided to start a life together. Steve Martin and Anne Stringfield's marriage quickly became one of the most private relationships in the entertainment industry. They rarely appeared in public together and almost never shared much about their personal life. But that very quietness was exactly what Steve Martin had been searching for all those years. After periods full of ups and downs in his life, he finally had a real home, a place, without stage lights, without camera flashes, just quietness and the presence of someone who understood him. For Steve Martin, this carried a meaning far deeper than any career success. He had once stood in front of tens of thousands of audiences, received long rounds of applause, and been known across America. But those things couldn't bring the peace he found in family life. After many years of loneliness, after periods when he wondered if he would ever have a real home, Steve Martin finally had his answer. Perhaps what makes this story so touching is the timing it happened. When Steve Martin married Anne Stringfield, he was no longer a young man just starting his career. He had gone through many chapters of life success, failure, fame, and loneliness, and it was precisely when he least expected it, when he had grown used to living alone, that life gave him a new chance to start again. But the most surprising thing in that new chapter of Steve Martin's life hadn't happened yet, because a few years later, at an age when most people had entered the resting phase of life, Steve Martin would experience something he once thought he might never have. And then in 2012, when Steve Martin had turned 67, his life changed once again, in a way he couldn't have imagined when he was young. After many decades of living amid fame, art, and long silences of loneliness, Steve Martin became a father for the first time. The news surprised many people. At an age when most had become grandparents, Steve Martin was starting a completely new chapter of life, the chapter of a father. To the public, this might have been just an interesting tidbit about an aging Hollywood star, but for Steve Martin, that moment carried deeper meaning than any role he had ever played, or any award he had ever received. When his daughter was born, Steve Martin's life changed in a very simple but also very powerful way. The days once filled with filming schedules, flights, and performances were now replaced by moments he had never experienced before. Holding his child in his arms, hearing her first cry, seeing a tiny being completely dependent on him. Steve Martin had once been the man who made millions of audiences laugh. But for the first time in his life, he felt a completely different joy, the joy of becoming a father. Perhaps what makes this moment so emotional is the long journey Steve Martin had traveled to reach it. For many years of his life, he had thought he might never have a real family. When he was young, his career took up almost all his time. Tours, films, artistic projects followed one after another, making his personal life fragile. After the 1994 divorce, there were periods when Steve Martin had grown accustomed to the idea that he would live a fairly solitary life. He had once worried that one day, when the stage lights went out, he might be left alone. But when he held his daughter in his arms for the first time, all those thoughts seemed to melt away. In that moment, the titles, the rounds of applause, the praising articles, all of it became small compared to the feeling of looking into the eyes of the child who had just entered this world. Steve Martin later shared that becoming a father at 67 truly changed the way he looked at life. When he was young, he was always busy chasing success and perfecting his career. But when his daughter was born, he began to see time in a different way. Every day became more precious. Simple moments like walking with her, reading books to her, or just sitting together brought deep happiness. For Steve Martin, becoming a father at that age also brought an advantage he didn't have when he was younger: calmness. He was no longer caught up in Hollywood's pressures like before. He had experienced enough success and failure to understand that the most important thing in life isn't fame or public attention. What matters is real relationships. The people who stay by your side when the stage lights go out. And now, Steve Martin no longer had to face those silences alone. The image of Steve Martin in the years that followed became different from before. He still continued creating, still participated in artistic projects, but his life no longer revolved around his career the way it once did. Instead, he spent much more time with his family. The man who once stood in front of tens of thousands of people now found joy in the small things of family life, things he once thought he might never have. Perhaps the most beautiful thing in this story is the quiet change in Steve Martin's soul. The man who once feared loneliness in old age no longer carried that fear. He had a home, a wife, and a daughter. A family. And sometimes those seemingly small things turn out to be the greatest miracles in a person's life. But even when Steve Martin's personal life finally found peace, his story wasn't over yet. Because at an age when many people had already left the stage lights behind, Steve Martin continued to prove that his talent and creative passion had never truly disappeared. And as he entered the later years of his career, Steve Martin wasn't just remembered as a famous comedian or a successful actor. He began to be seen as one of the most profoundly influential artists on American culture over more than half a century. What Steve Martin created wasn't just funny movies or performances that made audiences laugh. He changed the way America viewed comedy. Before Steve Martin appeared, stand-up comedy mostly took place in small clubs, with everyday stories and familiar punchlines. But Steve Martin broke all those rules. He brought comedy to massive stages, turning it into an experience almost like performance art. He blended absurdity, intelligence, and unexpected moments in ways few had dared to try before. And that boldness opened the door for many generations of comedians to come. Not just in comedy, Steve Martin's influence spread to film and popular culture. The movies he was in became part of the memories of many generations of American audiences. The characters he played, sometimes clumsy, sometimes quirky, but always deeply human, made audiences see themselves in them. He didn't just make people laugh. He made them feel warm and close. In an entertainment world often dominated by big effects and dramatic stories, Steve Martin proved that a sincere smile sometimes has more lasting power than anything else. His contributions to art and culture were ultimately recognized at the highest level. In 2005, Steve Martin was awarded the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, the most prestigious honor for comedians in the United States. That award didn't just celebrate his personal achievements, it also recognized his role in shaping modern comedy as a whole. When he received it, many young artists mentioned Steve Martin as the biggest inspiration in their careers. A few years later, in 2013, Steve Martin received another special honor, the Honorary Academy Award and Honorary Oscar for his long-term contributions to cinema. To many in the film industry, this was a well-deserved recognition for an artist who had spent his entire life bringing joy to audiences. Steve Martin may not have been someone who constantly chased dramatic roles to win an Oscar, but his influence on film, especially in comedy, was undeniable. What makes Steve Martin's story even more special is that he didn't stop after receiving those honors. Many artists in their 70s or nearing 80 often choose to step away from the stage lights and enjoy a peaceful life after a long career. But Steve Martin never seemed to fully abandon his creative passion. Instead, he kept finding new ways to tell stories and connect with audiences. One of the clearest examples of that is the television series Only Murders in the Building. When the show premiered, many were surprised to see Steve Martin, who was then nearing 80 still, acting and creating content with astonishing energy. In the series, he not only starred but also helped develop ideas and produce. The show quickly became one of the most beloved series, attracting audiences from many different generations. What's interesting is that in Only Murders in the Building, Steve Martin seemed to carry his entire life's experience with him. The humor, the subtlety, and even the quiet moments of the character he played all reflected an artist who had lived through many different chapters of life. Audiences didn't just see a veteran comedian performing. They saw an artist who was still creating, still curious about the world, and still finding joy in telling new stories. At nearly 80, Steve Martin no longer needed to prove anything to Hollywood. He had a career that many artists could only dream of, but what makes his legacy special isn't just the number of films or awards. It's the way he continued to live with creativity and curiosity, even after achieving every success. Steve Martin once made all of America laugh when he was a young comedian, but in this phase of his life, he brings something different. The image of an artist who has gone through many ups and downs, but still keeps the joy of creation. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy. Not just the jokes, but a life that proves art doesn't have a short shelf life. If nurtured with passion and sincerity, it can continue to live, continue to grow, and continue to bring meaning to both the artist and the audience throughout an entire lifetime. And when looking back at Steve Martin's entire journey, what emerges isn't just the story of a famous comedian or a Hollywood star. It's the story of a human being who has gone through so many different chapters of life, chapters full of light, but also chapters that were very quiet. To audiences, Steve Martin often appears as the man who makes the whole world laugh, an artist with his signature silver hair, a slightly shy smile, and an intelligent comedic style that has become an icon of American culture. But behind that image is a much more complex person. Steve Martin isn't someone who has always been happy, and he isn't someone who has never known loneliness. His story began with a boy growing up in a family where words of praise rarely appeared. Steve Martin was once a child who simply wanted his father to be proud of him, but those words of recognition didn't come easily. Perhaps that's why, from a very early age, he learned to seek his value elsewhere, in small magic tricks, in spontaneous jokes, and in the ability to make others smile. The first laughs he heard at Disneyland weren't just audience reactions. For Steve Martin, they were like a sign that he could also bring something to the world. The years that followed weren't easy at all. There was a long time when Steve Martin lived almost invisibly in the entertainment industry, writing scripts for others and wondering if he truly had enough talent. He once sat in his small apartment, staring at pages filled with comedic ideas and asking himself, maybe I'm just not funny enough. But he kept writing, kept experimenting, kept moving forward even without knowing where that path would lead. And then one day, the laughter he created began to echo farther. From small clubs to big theaters, then to stadiums packed with audiences. Steve Martin became the biggest comedian in America. But that peak also brought silences that few people saw. When the laughter of tens of thousands faded, he would often return to his hotel room alone. Long, quiet hallways, identical rooms, evenings with no one to share them with. All of it created a strange contrast with the image of the man who made the whole world laugh. It was during those years that Steve Martin began to realize success didn't always bring peace. And in 1981, he did something very few artists dare to do. He walked away from stand-up comedy at the height of his success. To many people, that decision seemed incomprehensible, but to Steve Martin, it was the only way to hold on to the real part of himself. He started over in film, proving he wasn't just a comedian, but also a real actor and creator. Even so, his personal life still went through challenges. His marriage to Victoria Tennant ended, leaving behind long years of loneliness. There were periods when Steve Martin lived quite apart from the world, spending time on writing, music, and his own thoughts. But perhaps it was precisely in those silences that he learned how to turn loneliness into art. Banjo music helped him rediscover the joy of creation. Books helped him tell his own story. And over time, Steve Martin realized that an artist isn't defined only by the brilliant moments on stage, but also by how they face the dark periods in life. Then his life changed once again. Love arrived when he least expected it. His marriage to Anne Stringfield brought him a peaceful home, and at 67, Steve Martin became a father for the first time. The moment he held his daughter in his arms wasn't just new joy. It was an answer to the fears he had carried for so many years. The man who once worried he might grow old in loneliness now had a family, a place to return to when the stage lights went out. At nearly 80, Steve Martin no longer needs to prove anything to the world. He has received the greatest honors an artist can achieve, from the Mark Twain Prize to the honorary Oscar. But what makes his story special isn't just those awards. What makes it memorable is how he continues to create, continues to seek meaning in art, even after going through so many ups and downs. The series Only Murders in the Building is proof that Steve Martin still finds joy in storytelling and bringing laughter to audiences. Looking back at his life, one can see a very beautiful paradox. Steve Martin isn't someone who has never felt sorrow. He isn't someone who has never felt lost. But those very experiences helped him create moments that made the whole world laugh. He turned sadness into laughter, loneliness into art, and the silences of life into stories that millions could relate to. And perhaps that is what makes Steve Martin a legend, not just because he's funny, but because he lived a very human life with fears, hopes, and fresh starts. Because sometimes the people who make the whole world laugh are the ones who spent their lives learning how to survive silence. Sometimes the people who make the world laugh are the ones who spent their lives learning how to survive silence. Looking back at the entire story of Steve Martin, what evokes both heartache and deep respect isn't just his brilliant achievements, but the long journey filled with silences behind the laughter. A boy who grew up in a home where his father rarely expressed pride. A young man who had to work at the magic shop in Disneyland just to find a place where he felt he had value. Then an artist who once sat alone in a small apartment wondering, maybe I'm just not funny enough. All those details show that Steve Martin didn't step into the stage lights with ready-made confidence. He built it from very human wounds. Even when he became the biggest comedian in America, performing in front of tens of thousands of people and selling millions of comedy albums, his life was never a perfect story. The nights returning to empty hotel rooms after shows, the painful decision to leave stand-up comedy in 1981 at the peak of his success, the 1994 divorce, and many years of living in silence, all of it shows that fame cannot erase a person's loneliness. But it's precisely the way Steve Martin faced those periods that makes his story so worthy of admiration. He didn't collapse. He rediscovered himself through banjo music, writing books, creating art, and then unexpectedly found family when he married Anne Stringfield and became a father at 67. For the American people, this story reminds us of a very familiar but always thought-provoking lesson. True success isn't just in fame or money, but in the ability to keep creating, keep hoping, and keep building meaning in one's life even after the loneliest years. Steve Martin didn't just make America laugh, he showed that even the seemingly strongest people have silent battles, and it's overcoming those dark moments that creates a true legacy. If the story of Steve Martin, the man who turned loneliness into laughter for the whole world, makes you reflect, please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the real stories behind the lives of Hollywood legends. Thank you for listening to this emotional journey, and see you in the next video, where we'll open up another story full of tears, resilience, and hope.